The dense canopy of North Sentinel Island filters sunlight into ghostly beams as Kanu crouches motionless beside a freshwater stream. His weathered hands, scarred from 20 years of brutal survival, hover inches from a fish that could mean the difference between life and death. No spear, no net, no fire to cook with, just flesh against nature's razor edge. 2 decades ago, Kanu was the tribe's most skilled hunter, respected and feared. Then came the night he made contact with outsiders, a violation so severe it earned him permanent banishment from his people. Cast out with nothing but the knowledge passed down through generations, he faced an impossible choice: die quickly or learn to live like no human ever has. For 20 years he's hunted with bare hands, made shelter from memory, and survived storms that would crush modern survivors. He's broken bones and healed them alone. He's faced starvation and tigers with nothing but prehistoric instincts. But what drove him to risk everything for that forbidden encounter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fish darts left, silver scales catching filtered light. Kanu's breathing slows to match the rhythm of the water. His grandfather taught him this patience when he was 7, sitting by this same stream. "The fish knows your heartbeat through the water," the old man had whispered. "Make it forget you exist." 20 years of exile have refined that lesson into something darker. Kanu doesn't just make the fish forget. He becomes something else entirely. His pulse drops to nearly nothing. His muscles lock into position that would cripple lesser men. The scars across his palms, carved by countless failed attempts, remind him of the price of impatience. The fish settles, fins barely moving. Now, his hands explode forward with shocking violence. Not toward where the fish is, but where it will be in the microsecond it takes muscle to react to threat. His left palm creates a wall, his right forms a trap. The fish slams into the cage of his fingers with desperate force. Blood clouds the water. The fish's spine has cut him again, but Kanu's grip never wavers. He's learned to ignore pain that would send civilized men into shock. 20 years ago, this same injury would have meant days of rest, while the tribe's healer tended his wounds. Now it's simply Tuesday. He pulls the fish from the stream and studies it with the calculating eye of a man who's eaten everything this island can offer. The species is familiar. Sweet flesh, but bones that can puncture intestines if swallowed wrong. He'll have to be careful during the meal, picking each morsel clean. No one will find his body if he chokes. No one will mourn. The fish stops struggling. Kanu places it on a flat stone he's positioned for this purpose, one of dozens of such preparations scattered across his territory. Survival isn't just skill, it's architecture. Every tool positioned precisely, every path memorized, every contingency planned. He's become a ghost haunting his own elaborate machine. His fingers work with surgical precision, separating flesh from bone. The tribe taught him this as a boy, but exile refined it into art. Every scrap of protein matters when your next meal isn't guaranteed. Every mistake could be your last. As he eats, memories surface unbidden. The night that changed everything. The ship's lights on the horizon brighter than any star. The Sacred Council's decision to investigate. And his choice, the choice that damned him, to approach the strangers first. He remembers their faces. Pale skin like sun-bleached coral. Strange garments that seemed to shift and change in the moonlight. They'd spoken in sounds his throat couldn't replicate, but their eyes held something recognizable, fear. They'd been as terrified as he was. The exchange lasted only minutes. Metal objects passed between hands. Sounds that might have been words. The moment when understanding flickered between species separated by millennia of development. He'd felt the weight of history shifting, plates of fate grinding against each other. Then came the discovery. His own people, emerging from the tree line with weapons raised. The strangers fleeing to their floating village. The terrible silence as his tribe realized what he'd done. Kanu swallows the last of the fish and wipes his hands on moss. The afternoon light is shifting, which means time to check his shelter before the evening rains. Every day follows the same pattern now. Hunt, eat, repair, hide, survive. But sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, he still sees those pale faces, still wonders what those metal objects were meant to convey, still questions whether the knowledge gained was worth the price of everything lost. The forest around him holds no answers, only the endless repetition of survival. Tomorrow will bring the same stream, the same fish, the same careful dance between life and death. He rises and melts back into the shadows, leaving only disturbed water to mark his passage. The judgment came with the rising sun. Kyle sat bound in the center of the village circle, his wrists raw from the coconut fiber ropes that had held him through the night. The entire tribe had gathered, men, women, and children forming concentric rings around him, their faces painted with the white clay of mourning. But they mourned not for him, he realized. They mourned for themselves, for the contamination he had brought upon them all. Elder Naru stepped forward, his weathered hands gripping the ceremonial staff carved from the bone of a great whale that had washed ashore in his grandfather's time. The old man's eyes, clouded with age but sharp with purpose, fixed upon Kyle with a mixture of sorrow and steel. "You have seen the Forbidden Ones," Naru's voice carried across the silent gathering. "You have breathed their poison air, you have looked upon their cursed forms and lived to return." The elder's words fell like stones into still water, each one sending ripples of fear through the assembled crowd. Kyle's mother, Lyra, stood among the women, her face a mask of controlled anguish. She had not spoken to him since the hunters dragged him back to the village. She could not. To acknowledge him now would be to share his fate. "The ancestors whisper of great sickness that follows such contact," Naru continued, raising the staff above his head. "They speak of death that comes on the wind, that enters through the eyes and mouth, that steals the breath from children and makes the strong weak as newborn fish." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices rising and falling like waves against the shore. Kyle had heard these stories since childhood, tales of other islands where the outsiders had come with their pale skin and strange coverings, leaving only empty villages and scattered bones in their wake. "But the ancestors also speak of mercy," the elder said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The crowd leaned forward, straining to hear. "Not the mercy of forgiveness, for there can be none, but the mercy of distance." Kyle's chest tightened. He had expected death, a quick arrow to the heart or a spear thrust to spare the tribe any further contamination. This was something far worse. Kyle of the Red Fish clan, son of Tavu, the bold, student of the sacred hunt, Naru's voice grew formal, ritualistic. "You are no longer of this place. You are no longer of this people. You are no longer of this world." The elder lowered the staff until its carved tip pointed directly at Kyle's heart. "From this sun to the end of all suns, you walk alone." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "You will take nothing that belongs to the living," Naru decreed. "No weapons forged by tribal hands, no tools shaped by tribal skill, no food grown in tribal soil. You carry only the knowledge in your head and the strength in your body." The elder paused, his voice catching slightly. "And you will never return. Should you be seen again in these waters, you will be killed from a distance, your body left for the sharks." Two hunters moved forward, Jakara and Manu, men who had once called him brother. They cut his bonds but kept their spears pointed at his back as he stood on unsteady legs. His limbs had cramped during the long night, and pins and needles shot through his feet as blood returned to them. The crowd parted before him like a school of fish before a predator, creating a path toward the beach. No one met his eyes. Children who had once laughed at his jokes now buried their faces in their mothers' arms. Hunters who had shared successful kills with him turned their backs. Only his mother remained facing him, tears streaming down her painted cheeks. Her lips moved silently, and though he could not hear the words, Kyle knew she was speaking the prayer for the dead. For in every way that mattered, Her son had died the moment he chose to approach that boat. He walked through the village one last time, his bare feet following paths he had known since he could walk, past the fire pit where his father had taught him to knap flint, past the great meeting hut where he had received his hunter's marks, past the small dwelling where he had been born 22 seasons ago. At the water's edge, a single outrigger canoe waited, old and patched, barely seaworthy but functional. It was the boat reserved for the dead, used to carry bodies to the deep water for sky burial. Today would carry something else, a living ghost. Kyle pushed the craft into the surf and climbed aboard. Behind him, the entire tribe had followed to the beach, watching in silence as he paddled beyond the reef into the open ocean. He did not look back. To do so would be to tempt fate further, to risk bringing even more calamity upon the only people he had ever known. The current caught his canoe and pulled him south, toward a horizon that held no promises, only the certainty of solitude. The council of elders gathered at dawn, their painted faces grave as storm clouds. Kyle knelt before them on the sacred sand, his head bowed while the weight of their silence pressed down like the humid air before a typhoon. Behind him, he could feel the eyes of his entire tribe, men, women, and children, who had shared his fires, his hunts, his laughter. Now they watched as if he were already a ghost. Elder Taku, the oldest among them, spoke first. His voice carried the authority of 7 decades and the wisdom of countless seasons. You have touched the cursed ones. Their sickness flows in your blood now, and through you it would poison us all. I saved our children, Kyle said, his voice barely above a whisper. The metal beast would have... Silence! Elder Mira's shout cut through the morning air like a spear. The children would have hidden, as we have always hidden. The outsiders would have passed, as they always pass. But you chose to reveal yourself. You chose to break the law that has protected us since the time of our ancestors' ancestors. Kyle's throat tightened. He wanted to explain how the children had frozen in terror, how the strange floating vessel had been heading straight for their hiding spot among the mangroves. But the elders' faces remained carved from stone, unmoved by his silent pleas. Elder Taku raised his gnarled hand, and the gathering fell into absolute quiet. Even the morning birds seemed to pause their songs. The law is older than memory, Hunter. No contact with the pale skins, no touch of their corrupted flesh, no mercy for those who break this sacred boundary. 20 years, Elder Mira announced, her voice carrying across the beach like a death song. 20 years in the forbidden places, beyond the sight of clean water and pure air. If the spirits deem you worthy, if you can cleanse the corruption from your soul, you may return. If not, she let the words hang in the salt-tinged air. Kyle's sister Nera stepped forward from the crowd, tears streaming down her painted cheeks. Please, honored elders. He is the finest hunter among us. Without him, we remain pure, Elder Taku said firmly. With him, we all perish from the outsider's poison. The final ritual began before the sun reached its zenith. Kyle watched as everything he had ever owned was fed to a great fire on the beach. His best spears, crafted with patient skill over many seasons. His fishing nets, woven with threads his grandmother had taught him to twist. His ceremonial shell ornaments, passed down through generations of his family, all of it turned to ash and smoke that the wind carried out to sea. His mother approached, her face a mask of grief and determination. In her hands, she carried a single item, his father's obsidian knife, the blade napped with such skill it could split a hair. Take this, she whispered, pressing it into his palm. Your father would want you to have it wherever your path leads. The elders pretended not to see this small violation of the exile ritual. Perhaps even they understood that sending a man into the wilderness with nothing but his hands was a sentence of death rather than purification. As the afternoon sun began its descent, Kyle stood at the edge of everything he had ever known. The elders had chosen his destination, the small island of Kalute, visible as a dark smudge on the horizon. It was a place of taboo where the ancestors said evil spirits dwelled in the twisted trees and poisoned streams. No member of the tribe had set foot there in living memory. "Go now," Elder Taku commanded. "Let the spirits judge whether you can find your way back to purity." Kyle waded into the surf, the warm water rising around his legs as he pushed the small outrigger canoe toward deeper water. Behind him, his people began the song of the dead, not because he had died, but because to them he had ceased to exist. For 20 years, his name would not be spoken aloud. His deeds would not be remembered in the evening stories. He had become a ghost among the living. The paddle felt strange in his hands as he struck out across the channel. He had made this same motion thousands of times in familiar waters, but now each stroke carried him further from everything that defined him. The island of Kalute grew larger as his homeland shrank, until his tribe was just a collection of dots on a distant shore. As darkness fell, Kyle pulled his canoe onto an alien beach for the first time in his life. The sand felt different beneath his feet, coarser, colder, unwelcoming. Strange bird calls echoed from the interior jungle, and unfamiliar scents carried on the night wind. He had survived his first day of exile. Only 7,299 remained. The fever came on the third day after the whale meat spoiled. Kyle's body burned as if the sacred fires of his ancestors raged within him, yet he shivered uncontrollably beneath the crude shelter he'd fashioned from palm fronds and driftwood. His vision blurred, transforming the familiar coastline into a writhing mass of shadows and phantom shapes. In his delirium, the voices of his people whispered accusations through the wind. His father's weathered face materialized in the smoke of his dying fire, eyes heavy with disappointment. The elders pointed their bone spears at him, chanting the words that had sealed his fate. "You have brought the curse of the outsiders upon us. You are no longer our son." But it was Mira's voice that cut deepest, her final words echoing as she pressed something small and hard into his palm before the warriors dragged him to the boat. "Remember who you are beneath your skin," she had whispered. Even now, through the haze of sickness, he could feel the carved turtle shell pendant she'd given him, worn smooth by generations of hands. The fever broke on the 7th day, leaving him weak as a newborn, but clear-minded for the first time since his exile began. His water supply had dwindled to nothing, and his tongue felt thick and foreign in his mouth. The rain hadn't come for days, and the small depression in the rocks where he'd collected water from the last storm showed only cracked mud and the white residue of salt. Kyle forced himself to stand, his legs trembling with the effort. The beach stretched endlessly in both directions, an unforgiving expanse of black sand and jagged coral. Behind him, the jungle pressed close, a wall of green that seemed to pulse with hidden dangers. He had always been taught that the interior of any land beyond their sacred island held malevolent spirits, but water meant survival, and survival meant honoring Mira's final gift to him. The jungle swallowed him whole the moment he stepped beneath its canopy. Vines, thick as his torso, twisted around trees whose trunks disappeared into a ceiling of leaves so dense that only scattered coins of sunlight reached the forest floor. The air hung heavy with moisture, and the rich smell of decay, a perfume of life and death, intermingled. His bare feet found purchase on the soft carpet of rotting leaves as he followed what might have been an animal trail deeper into the green labyrinth. Every few steps, he paused to listen for the sound of running water, but heard only the alien calls of birds he couldn't name, and the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. The first stream he found ran bitter with minerals that burned his throat and cramped his empty stomach. He spat out the water and pressed on, fighting waves of dizziness that threatened to send him tumbling into the thorny embrace of the jungle floor. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Lessons learned during the long nights when the old man had shared the deepest knowledge of their people. "Water that runs over stones sings true," the old hunter had said. "Water that sleeps in stillness may dream of poison." Hours passed before Kyle heard it, a gentle murmur that spoke of current and movement. He pushed through a curtain of hanging moss and found himself on the bank of a clear stream no wider than his outstretched arms. The water danced over a bed of smooth pebbles, catching fragments of filtered sunlight and throwing them back like scattered stars. He cupped the water to his lips tentatively, tasting the sweetness of life itself. When his stomach didn't rebel, he drank deeply, feeling strength flow back into his body with each swallow. He stripped off the tattered remains of his loincloth and waded into the stream, letting the cool water wash away days of fever sweat and the salt that had crusted on his skin. As he crouched in the shallows, something silver flashed between his feet. His hand shot down with the reflexes honed by years of spearing fish in the lagoons of home, closing around a struggling form. The fish was no longer than his hand, its scales rainbow bright in the dappled light, but it represented something more precious than food. It meant the skills of his people could sustain him even in this alien place. That night, he built his first inland camp beside the singing stream. The fish, cooked over a fire made with bow drill and tinder fungus found clinging to a dead tree, tasted better than any feast he'd shared in the communal huts of his tribe. As darkness settled over the jungle and brought with it a symphony of night sounds, Kyle clutched Mira's pendant and made a promise to the star-scattered sky above. He would survive not just to honor her memory, but to prove that the strength of his people lived on even in exile. The jungle had shown him water and food. Tomorrow he would begin to truly make it home. The monsoon arrived with a violence that shook the earth beneath Kyle's feet. For 3 days the sky had darkened incrementally, pregnant clouds gathering like mourners at a funeral. Now the deluge began in earnest, transforming his carefully constructed world into a battlefield of mud and rushing water. Kyle pressed himself against the back wall of his shelter, watching helplessly as the stream he had diverted for fresh water became a raging torrent. The bamboo framework groaned under the assault of wind and rain, and he could feel the ground beneath him growing soft and unstable. This was his first monsoon alone, and he was learning that survival required constant adaptation. Water began seeping through the palm frond roof, despite his careful layering. He had observed these storms from the safety of the village longhouse, surrounded by the collective wisdom and resources of his people. Now, with only his own knowledge to rely upon, every decision carried the weight of life or death. The wind shifted, driving rain horizontally through gaps he had not noticed during construction. Kyle grabbed his precious fire-making materials, the dry tinder wrapped in bark cloth, the carefully carved fire drill, and moved them to the highest, driest corner. Without fire, he would face not just cold and discomfort, but the inability to cook food or purify water. The village elders had always said that fire was the difference between human and animal. As the storm intensified, Kyle heard a deep groaning sound that made his blood freeze. Somewhere in the darkness beyond his shelter, a tree was falling. The crash that followed shook the ground like thunder, and he realized how exposed his position truly was. The clearing that had seemed perfect for its access to water and sunlight now felt like a trap, surrounded by giants that could topple at any moment. He spent the night listening to the forest's agony. Trees cracked and fell with sounds like breaking bones. Branches whipped against his shelter's walls, and twice he had to brace the structure with his own body weight when the wind threatened to tear it apart. Sleep was impossible. Survival demanded constant vigilance. When dawn finally broke grey and watery, Kyle emerged to survey the devastation. His fish trap had vanished, swept away by the swollen stream. The carefully tended patch where he had been encouraging useful plants to grow was now a muddy wasteland. Most devastating of all, his food cache, dried fish and preserved fruit stored in a raised platform, had been destroyed by a falling branch. Standing in the ruins of his small domain, Kyle felt the weight of exile more keenly than ever before. In the village, such losses would have been shared among many families. Food stores were communal, knowledge was passed freely, and the work of rebuilding would involve the entire community. Here, every setback fell on his shoulders alone. But as he stood there, something his grandfather had once told him surfaced from memory. The forest does not mourn its fallen trees, the old man had said while teaching him to track wild boar. It grows stronger from their death. This is the way of all living things. We bend, we break, we become soil for what comes next. Kyle began to work. First, he cleared the debris from around his shelter, salvaging what materials he could. The bamboo frame had held, proving the soundness of his construction, but the walls and roof would need extensive repair. He gathered fresh palm fronds and began the methodical process of rethatching. The work was backbreaking, made worse by the humid heat that followed the storm. Sweat mixed with mud as he hauled fallen branches away from his living space. His hands, already hardened by months of constant labor, developed new blisters from gripping wet bamboo and rough bark. As he worked, Kyle began to notice that the storm had brought unexpected gifts alongside its destruction. The fallen trees had exposed new root systems, some edible tubers that he could harvest. The churned earth revealed clay deposits perfect for making water vessels and food storage containers. The increased water flow had created new pools where fish might gather. By evening, exhausted but determined, Kyle sat beside a small fire built from storm debris. His shelter was weathertight again, and he had even improved the design based on lessons learned during the night's ordeal. The raised sleeping platform was now higher and better angled to shed water. Additional support posts would help it weather future storms. As darkness fell, he heard familiar sounds returning to the forest. Insects chirping, frogs calling from the new pools, the distant cry of a night bird. Life was reasserting itself with remarkable speed. The forest had absorbed the storm's fury and was already healing. Kyle understood that he too was changing. Each challenge stripped away another layer of his former life, revealing something harder and more essential beneath. The village hunter who had broken sacred law was disappearing, replaced by something new, a creature of the deep forest shaped by solitude and necessity into something his own people might no longer recognize. The monsoon would continue for months. This was only the beginning. The morning sun cast long shadows through the canopy as Kyle crouched beside the stream, his reflection fractured by the gentle current. 3 moons had passed since his exile, and his body had begun to adapt to the relentless demands of solitary survival. His hands, once smooth from a lifetime of shared tribal labor, now bore the permanent marks of his new existence. Calloused palms, scarred knuckles, and fingernails worn down to nubs from constant digging and scraping. He had learned to read the island's moods like the elders read the stars. The subtle shift in bird calls that preceded storms. The way certain flowers closed their petals before the rains came. The particular rustle of leaves that meant a wild boar was foraging nearby, presenting both opportunity and danger. Every sound, every scent, every change in the wind now held meaning that could determine whether he lived or died another day. His shelter had evolved from the crude lean-to of his first desperate night into something more substantial. Using techniques passed down through generations of his people, he had woven palm fronds into tight, waterproof panels. Bamboo poles, carefully selected and shaped with sharp stones, formed the frame. Clay from the riverbank, mixed with dried grass, sealed the gaps. It was not the communal longhouse of his birth, but it would keep him alive through the monsoon season that approached with each passing day. The isolation pressed against his mind like a physical weight. In the village, silence meant something was wrong. It meant danger lurked nearby or someone had died. Here, silence was his constant companion, broken only by his own voice when he spoke aloud to maintain his sanity. He found himself conducting long conversations with memories of his father, his brothers, even with Naya, though her phantom presence brought more pain than comfort. Food had become an obsession that consumed his waking hours. The mango trees provided temporary abundance, but he knew their season would end. He had learned to identify 17 different edible plants, memorizing not just their appearance, but their seasonal cycles, their preferred growing conditions, and how to prepare them safely. Some roots required extensive boiling to remove their toxins. Others could be eaten raw, but only in small quantities. His greatest triumph had been the fish trap. After 7 failed attempts, he had finally mastered the ancient technique his grandfather had demonstrated years ago, a complex weaving of thin bamboo strips that created a funnel impossible for fish to escape once they entered. The trap provided him with protein twice weekly, supplementing the grubs and insects he forced himself to consume despite their revolting taste. But protein remained his greatest challenge. The island's wildlife was sparse and wary. He had managed to kill 3 crabs and 1 small bird in all his time here, each success the result of hours of patient stalking. His spear, crafted from hardwood and tipped with a carefully knapped stone point, felt clumsy in his hands without the guidance of experienced hunters. Every missed throw meant starting over, retying the point, resharpening the edge. The loneliness ate at him in ways he had never anticipated. He caught himself saving interesting stones or unusually shaped pieces of driftwood, as if he might show them to someone later. He practiced conversations in his head, explaining his discoveries and techniques to imaginary companions. Sometimes he would hear voices in the wind or catch glimpses of human figures in his peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing but swaying vegetation. Sleep brought little relief. His dreams were filled with the sounds of village life, children laughing, women singing while they worked, men discussing the day's hunt. He would wake to devastating silence, and for several heartbeats he would forget where he was, expect to see the familiar faces of his family around the dying embers of a communal fire. The returning awareness of his situation hit him anew each morning like a physical blow. The spirits of the ancestors felt distant here, their voices muted by his shame and separation from sacred ground. He had tried to maintain the proper rituals, but without the ceremonial tools, without the community to witness and validate his observances, the prayers felt hollow. He wondered if they had abandoned him entirely or if his exile extended even to the realm of the dead. As the sun reached its peak, Kyle rose from beside the stream and gathered his tools, the digging stick, the cutting stone, the water gourd he had painstakingly carved and waterproofed with tree sap. Today he would venture to the far side of the island, where he had spotted what might be a grove of nut trees. The journey would take most of the day, and he would need to return before dark. He paused at the edge of his small clearing, looking back at the shelter that had become his entire world. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay his true home, his people, everything he had lost. But survival demanded he focus on what lay ahead, another day of searching, gathering, enduring, another day of learning whether a man could truly live as an island unto himself. The storm arrived without warning, as they often did in these waters. Kyle had been tracking a wild boar through the dense undergrowth when the first winds began to shake the canopy above. By the time he reached his shelter, the sky had turned the color of bruised flesh, and the ocean beyond the reef was churning white with fury. He had weathered countless storms over the past 15 years, but this one felt different. The air itself seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy, and the wind carried a metallic taste that made his teeth ache. As he secured his few precious possessions, the fire bow, his stone tools, the carefully maintained spear tips, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that this tempest would test every survival skill his ancestors had passed down through generations. The first tree fell just after sunset, crashing into the forest with a sound like thunder. Then another. The wind howled through the island with increasing ferocity, tearing at his shelter's palm frond walls and sending debris flying through the darkness. Rain lashed the ground in sheets so dense that breathing became difficult. Kyle huddled in the center of his hut, listening to his world being torn apart around him. By midnight, water was seeping through every gap in his shelter. The carefully banked coals of his fire hissed and died despite his desperate attempts to shield them. In the absolute darkness that followed, with only the chaotic symphony of wind and rain for company, Kyle felt truly alone for the first time since his exile began. The shelter's main support beams snapped near dawn, sending half the roof collapsing inward. Kyle barely rolled away in time to avoid being crushed by the heavy wooden frame. Cold rain immediately soaked through his remaining protection, and he realized with growing dread that his carefully constructed home was doomed. He spent the final hours of the storm pressed against the island's central ridge, using an overhang of volcanic rock as minimal shelter. His teeth chattered uncontrollably, and his fingers had gone numb hours ago. Every few minutes, lightning would illuminate the devastation below. Trees stripped bare, his garden plots flooded, debris scattered across the landscape like the bones of some massive creature. When the wind finally died and weak sunlight began filtering through the dissipating clouds, Kyle emerged to survey a transformed island. His shelter was completely destroyed, reduced to a scattered pile of broken poles and shredded palm fronds. The fruit trees he had carefully tended were either uprooted or stripped of their bounty. Worst of all, his freshwater collection system had been demolished, leaving him with only the water trapped in a few natural rock pools. But it was the state of his tools that truly shook him. The storm surge had reached far inland, and salt water had contaminated everything. His bow had warped beyond use, the carefully shaped wood now twisted and cracked. Many of his stone implements were simply gone, swept away by the flooding. The spear that had been his primary hunting weapon lay in 3 pieces, broken against the rocks. For the first time since leaving his tribe, Kyle felt the cold touch of despair. He had built his survival around routine, careful planning, and the gradual accumulation of resources. Now, in a single night, years of work had been undone. He was essentially starting over, but with the disadvantage of an island stripped bare of easy resources. The immediate priority was water. Moving methodically despite his exhaustion, Kyle began checking every depression and crevice in the volcanic rock for accumulated rainwater. Most pools were too small or contaminated with debris, but he found 3 that would sustain him for perhaps a week if he was careful. Using broad leaves as makeshift containers, he began the tedious process of transferring the precious liquid to a more secure location. Food would be the next challenge. The storm had likely driven most game into deep hiding, and his usual fishing spots near the reef were clogged with debris and churning sediment. But his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory, recounting stories of the great hurricane that had struck North Sentinel Island decades before Kyle's birth. The elders had survived by adapting, by remembering that their ancestors had built their knowledge through countless such trials. As the day progressed, Kyle began to notice that the storm had revealed as much as it had destroyed. Fallen trees exposed root systems rich with edible grubs and larvae. The receding surge had left behind pools of seawater trapped among the rocks, and some contained fish and crabs that had been swept inland. Most significantly, the violent winds had uncovered a cave system in the island's interior that he had never noticed before. That evening, as he huddled in the largest cave with a small fire built from driftwood, Kyle reflected on the day's harsh lesson. Survival was not about creating perfect conditions and maintaining them. It was about accepting that destruction was inevitable, that the ocean and sky would periodically reset everything back to nothing. True survival meant being able to begin again, as many times as necessary, with nothing but knowledge and determination. The storm had taken his comfort, but it had also reminded him who he truly was. The monsoon's fury had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Kyle emerged from his shelter to find streams carved into new paths, trees uprooted and scattered like bones, and his carefully constructed fish traps destroyed. 20 seasons of exile had taught him that nature's violence often preceded unexpected gifts, but this devastation felt different, more complete, more threatening to his delicate survival balance. He picked his way through the debris-strewn beach, cataloguing what remained of his domain. The large driftwood log that had served as his primary workstation lay half-buried in sand 50 paces from its original position. His smoking racks were gone entirely, twisted metal and wood fragments marking where the storm surge had reached its hungry fingers inland. But something else caught his attention, something that shouldn't exist in his isolated world. Partially buried beneath a tangle of seaweed and broken coral, A corner of faded blue fabric fluttered in the morning breeze. Kyle approached cautiously, his heart quickening with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity. With trembling hands, he pulled away the debris to reveal a waterproof bag, its synthetic material alien yet hauntingly familiar. Inside, wrapped in plastic sheeting, he found treasures that spoke of the world beyond his prison. A small knife with a folding blade, its steel unmarked by rust, packets of something that might have been food, their contents mysterious but potentially life-saving, a metal container that sloshed with liquid, and most precious of all, a fire-starting device that clicked and sparked with divine reliability. The knife felt strange in his weathered palm, too light, too perfect, lacking the honest weight of knapped stone. Yet when he tested its edge against a piece of driftwood, it sliced cleanly through fibers that would have required patient sawing with his primitive tools. The blade held memories of his father's hands, of iron traded with distant peoples, of a time when such marvels seemed ordinary. That night, he used the miraculous fire starter to kindle flames that danced higher and steadier than any he had managed in years. The warmth penetrated deeper than mere heat. It carried whispers of human ingenuity, of countless minds working together to create wonders his ancestors could never have imagined. As he stared into the hypnotic flames, Kyle felt the weight of his isolation pressing down like storm clouds. The liquid in the metal container proved to be fresh water, untainted by salt or sediment. He rationed it carefully, allowing himself only small sips that tasted of abundance and plenty. Each drop reminded him of village wells, of children playing near communal water sources, of the simple luxury of drinking without the constant threat of dehydration. One of the food packets contained dense, sweet cakes that dissolved on his tongue like concentrated sunshine. The flavors were unlike anything from his natural pantry, complex combinations that spoke of cultivation, processing, deliberate creation rather than wild harvest. He ate sparingly, making each morsel last, savoring not just the nutrition but the connection to human hands that had shaped this sustenance. Days passed as Kyle integrated these gifts into his survival routine. The knife transformed his daily tasks. Cutting fishing line became effortless. Preparing food required half the time. Crafting tools achieved new levels of precision. Yet with each use, he felt the growing weight of dependence on things he could never replace, never repair, never truly understand. The storm had also revealed something else. A section of reef previously hidden beneath shifting sands now lay exposed, its surface dotted with pools teeming with unfamiliar sea life. Translucent creatures with trailing tentacles pulsed through the shallow waters, while armored crabs scuttled between formations of coral unlike any he had seen. The knife allowed him to harvest these new protein sources with surgical precision, each successful hunt adding variety to his monotonous diet. But abundance brought its own torment. As his body grew stronger on improved nutrition, his mind wandered more frequently to memories of home. The knife's efficiency reminded him of tools his father had wielded. The water's purity echoed the taste of streams flowing through ancestral lands, and the processed food carried flavors that somehow evoked the complexity of communal feasts. One evening, as he sat sharpening a spear point with the miraculous blade, Kyle realized he was weeping. The tears came without warning, carrying 20 years of accumulated loneliness that no amount of survival success could wash away. The gifts from the storm had saved his life, but they had also torn open wounds he thought had scarred over completely. He thought of the young man who had been cast out for touching forbidden knowledge and wondered if this too was some cosmic test. The items spoke of a world that had continued evolving while he remained frozen in primitive struggle. Somewhere beyond his visible horizon, humans lived with such abundance that they could casually lose treasures that meant the difference between his life and death. The knife gleamed in the firelight, beautiful and terrible, a reminder that he remained forever caught between two worlds, exiled from one, unable to reach the other. The monsoon's fury had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. Kyle emerged from his shelter to find his carefully tended garden half drowned, the bamboo shoots he'd cultivated for months now bent and broken. The storm had lasted 3 days, longer than any he'd weathered in his 15 years of exile, and its aftermath revealed the true fragility of the life he'd built. Water still dripped from the canopy above as he surveyed the damage. His smoking rack lay scattered across the clearing, precious dried fish lost to the wind and rain. The raised platform where he stored his tools had collapsed under a fallen branch, and his collection of medicinal plants floated in muddy puddles that would take days to drain. But it was the silence that unsettled him most. The usual chorus of birds and insects had vanished, replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by the steady drip of water and the distant crash of swollen streams. Even the island seemed to hold its breath, waiting for life to return. Kyle began the familiar ritual of rebuilding. His hands, scarred and calloused from years of survival, moved with practiced efficiency. He salvaged what he could from the debris, his mind cataloguing losses and calculating what needed immediate attention. Food first, then shelter repairs, then the long process of replanting. As he worked, memories surfaced unbidden. His father teaching him to read the sky's moods, the way clouds gathered before the fierce storms of the wet season. His grandfather's stories of great tempests that had reshaped the very coastline of their homeland. The elders' warnings about respecting the spirits of wind and water and the ceremonies performed to ensure their favor. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, cut off from those protective rituals, facing nature's wrath with nothing but the knowledge they'd given him and his own stubborn will to survive. Sometimes he wondered if the spirits followed him into exile, testing him in ways they'd never tested his people on the protected shores of home. By midday, he'd managed to construct a temporary drying rack and had begun the process of salvaging his tools. Many of his carefully crafted implements were damaged beyond repair, but the techniques remained locked in his memory. He could make new ones, had done so countless times before. Each loss was temporary, only death was permanent. The sound reached him as he worked on reshaping a bent spear point. At first, he thought it was the wind through the damaged trees, but gradually he recognized it for what it was, the distinctive whine of an engine, not the deep rumble of the supply boats that occasionally passed far offshore, but something smaller, closer. Kyle froze, his blood turning cold. In all his years of exile, nothing had come this close to his sanctuary. He'd chosen this particular corner of the island precisely because it was hidden from the shipping lanes, protected by treacherous reefs that kept larger vessels at bay. Moving carefully through the dripping undergrowth, he made his way toward the sound. The engine grew louder as he approached the shoreline, and through the tangle of storm-damaged vegetation he caught his first glimpse of the intruders. A small motorboat, painted in faded blue and white, had run aground on the narrow beach where he sometimes gathered shellfish. 3 figures moved around it, their voices carrying clearly across the water. They spoke in accented English, but their features and movements suggested they were from one of the mainland tribes, probably fishermen blown off course by the storm. Kyle's mind raced. These weren't the dangerous outsiders his people had always feared, the ones with pale skin and strange weapons. These were people much like himself, seeking shelter and safety, but they were still outsiders, still forbidden. He watched as they struggled to push their damaged boat back into the water. One of them, a young man about his own age, kept looking around nervously, clearly aware they were trespassing in prohibited waters. An older woman examined the boat's motor, while a third person, barely more than a child, sat on a piece of driftwood, looking exhausted and frightened. The right thing to do was nothing. Let them repair their boat and leave, pretend he'd never seen them. That was what his exile demanded, what his punishment required: complete isolation, no contact with the outside world. But the child's obvious distress stirred something in him he'd thought long buried. 20 years of solitude had taught him the value of human connection, even as it had been denied to him. These people needed help, and he had the knowledge to provide it. The internal struggle lasted only moments. Stepping from his concealment, Kyle walked slowly down to the beach, his hands open and visible in the universal gesture of peace. The three strangers spun toward him, fear and surprise clear on their faces. "Your boat," he said carefully in their language, words rusty from disuse. "I can help." The older woman studied him with intelligent eyes, taking in his weathered appearance and the obvious signs of long isolation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried both gratitude and wonder. "Who are you?" Kyle hesitated, then gave the only answer he could. "Someone who understands storms." The monsoon had been merciless that year, washing away half of Kyle's carefully constructed shelter and flooding the cave where he stored his tools. For 3 days, he huddled in the remaining corner of his hut, listening to the wind tear through the forest canopy above. When the storms finally passed, he emerged to find his world transformed yet again. 20 seasons had carved deep lines around his eyes and weathered his hands to leather, but his body remained strong from constant labor. The isolation had taught him to read the island's moods like an elder reads the stars. He knew which trees would fall before the next storm, where the freshwater springs would emerge after heavy rains, and how the animal paths shifted with the changing seasons. On this particular morning, as steam rose from the soaked earth, Kyle noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh footprints pressed into the mud near his fishing traps, human footprints that were not his own. His first instinct was to run, but 2 decades of exile had burned away the luxury of panic. Instead, he crouched low, studying the tracks with the intensity his father had once brought to reading enemy movements. The prints were smaller than his, lighter, but unmistakably human. They led from the beach inland, directly toward his territory. Kyle's mind raced through possibilities. Had the tribe sent someone to find him? Was this a test of his exile, or had something happened to his people? The thought that strangers might have landed on the island filled him with a different kind of dread. His people's laws about outsiders were absolute and deadly. He followed the trail carefully, every sense heightened. The tracks were perhaps half a day old, made during the final hours of the storm. Whoever had made them was struggling. The gait was uneven, and there were signs they had fallen multiple times in the mud. The trail led to a grove of bamboo he rarely visited, and there, huddled against the base of a massive trunk, Kyle found her. She was young, perhaps 16 seasons, and clearly one of his people despite being a stranger to him. Her traditional grass skirt was torn and muddy, her dark skin marked with cuts from her journey through the storm. She clutched a broken paddle to her chest, the remnant of a fishing canoe that had likely been torn apart by the winds. For a long moment, Kyle simply stared. To see another human being after 20 years of solitude was like watching the dead return to life. His throat constricted with emotions he had buried so deep he'd forgotten they existed. The girl stirred, her eyes fluttering open, and when she saw him, she gasped and scrambled backward. Kyle realized how he must appear, wild-haired, scarred, more spirit than man. He raised his hands slowly, speaking in their ancient tongue, words that felt strange on his lips after so many years of silence. "Peace, sister. I will not harm you." Her eyes widened with recognition, not of his face, but of his voice, his manner of speaking. You are one of us. But how? You are not from my village." Kyle's heart hammered. If she was from another village, it meant his own people had not been completely isolated. There were others, scattered across the island or perhaps the neighboring atolls. The knowledge filled him with hope and terror in equal measure. "I am Kyle, son of Tarek the hunter. I have lived alone in these forests for 20 seasons." The girl, she told him her name was Naya, had been caught in the storm while fishing with her father. Their canoe had been destroyed, and she had watched him disappear beneath the waves before washing up on this unfamiliar shore. Her village lay on the far side of the island, a place Kyle had never known existed. As he tended to her wounds with remedies learned through hard experience, Naya spoke of her people. They lived much as his own tribe had, following the old ways, hunting and fishing, avoiding the outside world. But there were differences, too. They had maintained contact with 2 other settlements, and their laws, while strict, seemed less absolute than those he remembered. For 3 days, Kyle cared for Naya as she recovered her strength. He showed her the edible plants, the clean water sources, the safe paths through his territory. In return, she shared news of the greater world beyond his exile, how the tribes had endured storms and seasons, births and deaths, the endless cycle of life he had been forced to abandon. But even as he treasured these moments of human connection, Kyle knew they were borrowed time. Naya would heal, and she would want to return to her people. The question that haunted his sleepless nights was whether his exile extended to her as well, whether helping her would damn them both, or whether these 20 years had finally earned him the right to step back into the world of the living. The choice, he realized with growing certainty, would define not just his future, but the very meaning of his long and terrible penance. The morning brought with it a revelation that would change everything. As Kyle descended toward the shoreline to check his fish traps, he spotted something that made his heart pound against his ribs like a caged bird. There, carved into the wet sand by the retreating tide, were footprints. Human footprints, but not his own. He crouched beside the markings, his weathered fingers tracing the edges where salt water still pooled. The prints were smaller than his, the stride shorter, and they led from the jungle's edge down to the water and back again. Someone had been here in the night, drinking from the stream that fed into the ocean, perhaps washing in the shallows. Kyle's mind raced through possibilities. Another exile? A lost fisherman from a distant tribe? Or worse, had someone finally come looking for him after all these years? The prints were fresh, made sometime between the highest tide and dawn. Whoever it was couldn't be far. He followed the trail backward, noting how the intruder had moved carefully, deliberately, trying to stay on rocks and fallen logs where possible. This person understood the art of concealment. The tracks led to his stream, where clear impressions in the muddy bank showed where someone had knelt to drink and splash water on their face. As he studied the scene, a twig snapped in the dense foliage behind him. Kyle spun around, his body tensing into a hunter's crouch, but saw nothing except the green wall of vegetation. Yet he felt eyes upon him, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Slowly he straightened and spoke into the silence. "I know you're there." His voice felt strange after so many years of talking only to himself and the island's creatures. "I won't hurt you." For long moments, nothing stirred except the gentle rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Then, like a shadow stepping into sunlight, a figure emerged from behind a massive strangler fig. It was a woman, young and lean, with the same dark skin and black hair of his people. But something was different about her. The way she held herself, the strange materials woven into her clothing, the small metal objects that glinted at her wrist and throat. She watched him with intelligent eyes that held no fear, only cautious curiosity. They stared at each other across the small clearing, two survivors taking each other's measure. When she finally spoke, her words were in his language, but with an accent he'd never heard before. "You're the ghost of Coral Point Island," she said, "the exile who lives beyond death." Kyle felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "Ghost? Is that what they call me?" She nodded slowly. "The old ones whisper stories. They say a hunter broke the oldest laws and was cast out to die on the Forbidden Island. But some claim to have seen smoke from your fires, heard your voice carried on the wind during storms. And you came to see if the stories were true." "I came because I had nowhere else to go." Her voice carried a weight of sorrow that he recognized all too well. "I am Mira of the northern shores. I too was exiled." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Kyle studied her face, seeing in it the same hollowed look he'd worn during his first years alone. The look of someone who had lost everything. "What was your crime?" he asked softly. Mira's jaw tightened. "I spoke against the chief when he would have sold our sacred places to the boat people for metal tools and cloth. I said our ancestors' bones were not for trading. For this, I was named traitor and cast out." Kyle understood. The world beyond their islands was pressing closer, bringing change and corruption. Some welcomed it, Others fought against it, and those who fought often paid the ultimate price. "How long have you been alone?" he asked. "3 seasons. I've been moving from island to island, staying ahead of the fishing boats, living on whatever I could find." She gestured toward the strange materials in her clothing. "Some of these came from the boat people's floating villages. I learned their ways to survive." The irony wasn't lost on him. She had been exiled for refusing to embrace the outside world, yet had been forced to use its gifts to stay alive. Survival made philosophers of them all. "This island provides enough for one," Kyle said carefully. "But not easily for 2. Mira nodded. "I know. I don't ask to stay. I only needed fresh water and a night's rest before moving on." But even as she spoke these words, Kyle could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way her eyes lingered on his well-built shelter visible through the trees. She was at the end of her strength, and they both knew it. After 20 years of solitude, the choice before him would reshape everything he had built, everything he had become. Save her, and risk losing the delicate balance that had kept him alive. Turn her away and become something he'd sworn never to be. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the salt-crusted air and the debris scattered across his carefully maintained camp. Kyle stood among the wreckage of 20 years, watching pieces of his life float away on the retreating tide. The shelter he'd rebuilt countless times lay in splinters. His fishing nets, painstakingly woven from plant fibers, hung torn from the mangrove branches like the shed skin of some massive serpent. But it wasn't the physical destruction that made his hands tremble as he surveyed the damage. It was the silence that followed, a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums like the weight of deep water. For 2 decades, he had grown accustomed to his own voice being the only human sound in his world, yet now even that seemed foreign to him. He began the familiar ritual of rebuilding, his movements automatic after so many repetitions. Gather the salvageable bamboo, strip new palm fronds, test each vine for strength before weaving. His hands moved with the precision of long practice, but his mind wandered to places he usually kept locked away. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very skills keeping him alive were the same ones that had led to his exile. His grandfather's voice echoed across the years, teaching him to read the sky for storms, to find fresh water on a seemingly barren atoll, to coax fire from wet wood. The old man had been preparing him for survival, though neither of them had imagined it would be survival like this, cut off not just from the world beyond their islands, but from their own people as well. As he worked, memories surfaced unbidden. The weight of his first spear in his hands, the pride in his father's eyes when he'd brought down a wild pig, the warmth of the communal fire during the storytelling hours, when the elders would speak of their ancestors who had lived on these waters since the world was young. Those same ancestors whose laws he had broken, whose judgment had sent him into this endless solitude. The sun climbed higher, and sweat began to sting the fresh cuts on his arms from handling the storm debris. He paused to drink from his precious water reserve, rationing each sip despite the rain that had replenished his collection system. Abundance was always temporary. Scarcity was the only constant he could count on. A movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. There, perched on a partially submerged log just beyond the reef line, sat a lone frigate bird. Its black silhouette was motionless, except for the occasional tilt of its head, as it studied him with one dark eye. Kyle hadn't seen another living creature in weeks. The storm had driven away even the fish and crabs that usually provided his sustenance. The bird and the man regarded each other across the shallow water. In that moment, Kyle felt a kinship with the creature that surprised him. Both of them were survivors, shaped by the harsh demands of life at the mercy of wind and wave. Both carried within them the knowledge passed down through countless generations about how to endure when the world turned hostile. He resumed his work, conscious of the bird's continued presence. As he lashed together the frame for his new shelter, he found himself speaking aloud for the first time in days. "You know something about storms, don't you, old friend?" His voice was rough from disuse, barely more than a whisper. "You know when to fly and when to hunker down, when to fight and when to yield." The frigate bird stretched its wings, magnificent black spans that spoke of countless journeys across trackless ocean, but didn't take flight. Instead, it settled more comfortably on its perch, as if accepting the man's presence just as the man had accepted its own. Working with the bird as his only companion, Kyle began to understand something that had eluded him through 20 years of solitude. Survival wasn't just about the physical act of staying alive, it was about maintaining some connection to life itself, even when that connection was as fragile as the attention of a wild bird. As the day wore on, his new shelter took shape. It would be stronger than the last one, reinforced with lessons learned from this latest disaster. He had become an expert at building from ruins, at finding hope in the act of beginning again. Perhaps that was the truest skill his grandfather had taught him, not just how to survive the storm, but how to emerge from its aftermath still willing to rebuild. The frigate bird remained until sunset, when it finally spread its wings and disappeared into the darkening sky. Kyle watched it go with something approaching gratitude. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his endurance and ingenuity. But tonight, for the first time in months, he felt less alone with his determination to see another dawn. The approaching voices carried across the water like distant thunder, growing stronger with each passing moment. Kanu pressed himself against the rocky outcrop, his weathered hands gripping the stone so tightly his knuckles went white. 20 years of solitude had not prepared him for this moment, the return of his own people to waters he now considered his domain. Through the gap between two boulders, he watched 3 familiar silhouettes emerge from the morning mist. The lead canoe cut through the calm surface with practiced precision, its occupant scanning the shoreline with the methodical attention of a seasoned hunter. Behind him, 2 younger warriors paddled in synchronized rhythm, their movements speaking of countless hours spent perfecting their craft. Kanu's breath caught as he recognized the lead figure. Taro, his younger brother by 3 seasons, now bearing the scars and bearing of a full warrior. The boy who had once stumbled through the forest chasing wild pigs had transformed into something formidable, his shoulders broad and his movements deliberate. Time had carved away the softness of youth, leaving behind someone Kanu barely recognized yet knew intimately. The canoes approached the small inlet where Kanu had built his most recent shelter, his heart hammered against his ribs as he realized they were heading directly toward the evidence of his survival. Fish bones scattered near his fire pit, the carefully constructed lean-to, the collection of sharpened tools, all proof that someone had been living here. Taro raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. His voice carried across the water in the familiar cadence of their native tongue, words that struck Kanu like physical blows after so many years of silence. Someone has been here recently. The ashes are still warm. The younger warriors pulled their canoes closer to shore, their eyes scanning the tree line with practiced wariness. Kanu watched one of them, a youth he didn't recognize, examine the fish bones with obvious curiosity. The boy said something in rapid, excited tones, but Taro's sharp gesture silenced him immediately. "We search carefully," Taro commanded. "Whoever lives here may still be close." Kanu closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 2 decades pressing down on him like a physical force. Part of him wanted to stand, to call out his brother's name, to end this torturous exile with a single word. But the memory of the elders' judgment burned in his mind, the ritualistic casting out, the declaration that he had ceased to exist in their world. To reveal himself now would not just endanger his own life, but would force his brother to choose between family loyalty and tribal law. The searchers moved through his campsite with methodical thoroughness. Taro knelt beside the fire pit, running his fingers through the cold ashes. Something in his posture suggested recognition, though Kanu couldn't be certain what memories might be stirring in his brother's mind. The techniques visible in the shelter construction, the specific way the fishing tools had been crafted, these bore the unmistakable signature of their shared upbringing. "This person knows our ways," Taro murmured to his companions. "Look at how the shelter faces away from the prevailing winds. See how the fishing spears are balanced." He lifted one of Kanu's carefully crafted tools, examining it with obvious appreciation. "This is not the work of an outsider. The youngest warrior pointed toward the rocky outcrop where Kanu hid. "Should we search there as well?" Taro's gaze followed the gesture, and for a terrifying moment, Kanu felt certain their eyes had met across the distance. His brother stared at the rocks for long heartbeats, his expression unreadable. Then, inexplicably, he shook his head. "Whoever was here has moved on. We have what we came for." He held up several of the rare shells Kanu had collected from the deeper waters, the ones needed for the ceremonial ornaments worn during the harvest rituals. "The elders will be pleased." As quickly as they had arrived, the three warriors prepared to depart. Kanu watched them load the shells into their canoes, his heart aching with a loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. Taro took one last look around the campsite, his gaze lingering on details that seemed to hold personal significance. "Brother of my blood," Taro whispered, so quietly that only Kanu's trained ears could catch the words across the water. "If the spirits have kept you alive all these years, may they continue to watch over you." The canoes disappeared into the morning mist as silently as they had arrived, leaving Kanu alone with the devastating realization that his brother had known. Somehow, despite the passage of time and the weight of tribal law, Taro had recognized the signs of his presence and chosen mercy over duty. Kanu remained hidden until the sun reached its zenith, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. The shells they had taken could be replaced, but the knowledge that he remained connected to his people, even in exile, was a gift beyond measure. The fever came without warning, striking him down like a massive wave crashing over his carefully constructed world. For 3 days, Kyle burned with an intensity that made the tropical sun seem cool by comparison. His body shook violently as he lay on the palm frond mat he had woven years ago, now damp with sweat that poured from every pore. Delirium painted strange visions across his mind. He saw his father standing at the edge of the beach, gesturing for him to return home. His mother appeared beside their old hut, grinding tubers while humming the songs of his childhood. The familiar faces of his hunting companions emerged from the jungle shadows, their bows ready, their eyes filled with the camaraderie he had lost forever. But these visions twisted into darker forms. The outsider's boat materialized again and again, that cursed vessel that had sealed his fate. He relived the moment of contact, feeling once more the strange metal object pressed into his palm by the pale-skinned stranger. The weight of his exile crashed over him repeatedly, each wave more devastating than the last. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Kyle awoke to find himself weak as a newborn, his muscles refusing to obey even the simplest commands. The water gourd beside his sleeping area had been drained completely, and his lips were cracked like dried mud. He managed to crawl toward his rainwater collection system, a network of broad leaves and hollowed coconut shells that had sustained him through countless dry spells. The first drops of water on his tongue felt like liquid salvation. He drank slowly, fighting the urge to gulp greedily, knowing his body needed time to recover. As strength gradually returned to his limbs, he assessed the damage the illness had wrought on his domain. His small garden plot, carefully tended for over a decade, showed signs of neglect. The banana plants drooped sadly, their leaves yellowing from lack of water. The root vegetables he had cultivated using seeds saved from wild plants were withering in the harsh sun. Even his fish traps, woven from strips of bamboo and positioned strategically in the tidal pools, had been damaged by recent storms. The sight filled him with a despair deeper than any he had experienced since those first terrible months of exile. Everything he had built, every small victory against the relentless challenges of solitude, seemed to be crumbling. For a moment he considered simply lying back down and letting the jungle reclaim him. But something stirred within him, a spark that had been kindled by 20 years of survival against impossible odds. He remembered his grandfather's words, spoken during his initiation into manhood. The forest tests every hunter, not just with wild boar and venomous snakes, but with the voice inside that whispers of surrender. The true hunter learns to silence that voice. Kyle forced himself to stand, though his legs trembled with the effort. He began with the most essential task, securing fresh water. The recent rains had been sparse, and his collection system needed repair. Using strips of bark and vine, he mended the damaged channels and repositioned the collecting vessels to catch every precious drop. Next came food. His stored provisions were nearly depleted, and hunting would require strength he didn't yet possess. Instead, he turned to the tidal pools where small fish and crustaceans could be caught with patient observation rather than athletic prowess. He spent hours crouched beside the water, his homemade spear poised and ready, until finally his persistence was rewarded with several small catches. As days passed, his strength returned incrementally. He repaired his fish traps using techniques perfected over years of trial and error. The banana plants responded to careful watering and the addition of composted organic matter he had learned to prepare from fallen leaves and food scraps. His garden slowly came back to life under his renewed attention. But the fever had changed something fundamental within him. During those delirious days, the line between memory and reality had blurred, forcing him to confront truths he had long suppressed. The weight of his isolation had carved deep channels in his spirit, and he realized that surviving was no longer enough. He needed purpose beyond mere existence. He began to document his knowledge, not in writing, for he had never learned such skills, but through careful construction of teaching tools. Using shells, stones, and carved pieces of wood, he created elaborate models showing trap construction, plant identification, and weather prediction techniques. If anyone ever found this place, they would discover not just evidence of survival, but a complete education in living from the land. The work gave him new energy. Each carefully crafted lesson became a bridge between his old life and this strange new existence. He was no longer just an exile clinging to life. He was a keeper of ancient wisdom, preserving knowledge that might otherwise die with him. As the sun set on another day of careful labor, Kyle felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a quiet satisfaction that transcended mere survival. He had found his purpose in this wilderness prison, and with it, a form of peace. The morning mist clung to the island like a shroud as Kyle approached the sacred grove where he had first learned to hunt as a boy. 23 years of exile had weathered his face into leather, carved lines of solitude around his eyes, and turned his hair the color of storm clouds. Yet his steps remained sure, his senses sharp as obsidian. He had been preparing for this moment for months, ever since the dreams began visiting him with increasing frequency. In them, he saw his younger brother Tamman, now surely the tribe's lead hunter, standing at the water's edge, calling his name across the waves. The ancestors whispered in these visions, their voices like wind through bamboo, telling him the time of judgment approached. 3 days prior, he had completed the ritual cleansing his grandmother had taught him in childhood, fasting while bathing in the sacred pool beneath the waterfall. He had painted his body with the traditional patterns using clay and charcoal, each mark a prayer for forgiveness, each line a testament to his endurance. The irony was not lost on him that his survival skills, honed through decades of isolation, might now be what allowed him to die with honor. The grove opened before him like a cathedral of green, ancient trees forming pillars that stretched toward a canopy so thick it blocked most of the sky. This was where Tamman would come for the morning hunt, following the same paths their father had walked, and his father before him. Kyle positioned himself beside the massive strangler fig that had served as a landmark since his youth, its trunk now even more gnarled and imposing. He did not wait long. The subtle snap of a twig, the whisper of feet on moss, the barely perceptible disturbance in the forest's rhythm, all announced his brother's approach long before Tamman emerged from the undergrowth. The man who stepped into the clearing was broader than Kyle remembered, his muscles thick from years of wielding the traditional weapons, his face bearing the ritual scars of a proven warrior and elder. They faced each other across 30 feet of sacred ground, neither moving, neither speaking. Tamman's hand rested on the bone handle of his knife, while his other gripped a fishing spear. His eyes, dark as the deepest ocean, showed no surprise at finding his exiled brother here. Perhaps he too had been having dreams. "You should not have come back," Tamman said finally, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. "The taboo still stands. Your presence pollutes this place." Kyle straightened, feeling the weight of every lonely year in his bones. "I have lived as the dead for more than 2 decades. I have spoken to no one, touched no one, shared the fire with no one. The spirits have judged me through my isolation." "The spirits judged you when you chose to approach the outsider's boat," Tamman replied, taking a step forward. "When you touched their cursed metal, when you brought their sickness into our world." The memory of that day still burned in Kyle's mind, his curiosity overcoming his training as he swam out to examine the strange vessel that had drifted too close to their shores. He had only meant to investigate, to ensure no threat to the tribe. But when the pale-skinned strangers had thrown him a rope, when he had grasped it in wonder at its strange texture, he had sealed his fate. 3 tribal members had died of fever in the weeks that followed, and the elders had declared him cursed. "I have paid," Kyle said simply. "I have survived by the old ways, using only what our ancestors knew. I have become what they made me, a living ghost, a bridge between the world of the living and the dead. But I am still your brother." Tamman's grip tightened on his weapons. "My brother died the day he was cast out. You are something else now, something that does not belong here or anywhere." The truth of those words cut deeper than any blade. Kyle had indeed become something other than fully human, a creature of solitude who spoke to birds and fish, who read the moods of the sky like sacred text, who had survived impossibilities through sheer will and ancient wisdom. He was no longer the young man who had been exiled, but neither was he entirely the ghost Tamman claimed. "Then kill me," Kyle said, spreading his arms wide. "Complete the judgment. Send me to join the ancestors who have guided my survival." Tamman raised his spear, its bone point catching a shaft of sunlight that pierced the canopy. For a heartbeat, Kyle thought his brother would strike. Then Tamman's arm trembled, and the weapon lowered slightly. "You have become too strange to kill," Tamman whispered, "too changed to accept back. What are we to do with you, brother, who is not brother?" The question hung between them like smoke, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable, while the ancient trees bore silent witness to this meeting of 2 worlds, one bound by tradition, the other forged by impossible survival. The storm that had raged for 3 days finally broke, leaving the island washed clean and gleaming under a pale morning sun. Kyle emerged from his shelter, breathing deeply of the salt-sweet air that carried unfamiliar scents, diesel fuel, metal, and something else he couldn't identify but that made his stomach clench with ancient memory. On the eastern shore, where the waves had deposited countless gifts and curses over the years, something massive had beached itself. Not driftwood or debris, but a vessel unlike any he had seen in his 20 years of exile. Sleek white fiberglass reflected the early light, and foreign symbols marked its hull. The boat listed heavily to one side, its motor partially submerged, but it was intact. Kyle approached with the careful steps of a hunter, every sense alert. The craft was empty, but signs of recent occupation were everywhere. Water bottles, clothing, electronic devices dark and silent. A map, protected in plastic, showed his island as a tiny dot in a vast expanse of blue. His hands trembled as he traced the familiar outline of his homeland, so close yet impossibly distant. Inside a waterproof container, he found something that stopped his breath entirely. Photographs. The first showed tourists on a beach, pale skin gleaming with sunscreen, pointing cameras toward a tree line. His tree line. His people's sacred shore. The next image made his vision blur with rage and sorrow, warriors on the beach, bows drawn, protecting their home as they had been taught, as their ancestors had demanded. But it was the final photograph that shattered something deep in his chest. A young warrior, barely past his naming ceremony, lay motionless on the sand. An arrow protruded from his shoulder, but that wasn't what had killed him. His face was twisted in the agony that Kyle recognized from his own fevered dreams, the face of disease, of the invisible death that outsiders carried like poisoned arrows. The photograph fluttered from his numb fingers. The boy in the image could have been his son, if exile hadn't claimed that possibility. Could have been his brother's child, his cousin's pride. Instead, he was another casualty of the ancient war between worlds, another life lost to the curiosity and carelessness of those who couldn't understand that some boundaries were drawn in blood and necessity. Kyle's vision narrowed to a red tunnel of fury. His hands found the boat's emergency flare gun, hefting its weight, imagining the satisfaction of watching this vessel burn. Let the ocean claim it, as it had claimed so many others. Let no trace remain of this intrusion, this bearer of tragedy. But as he raised the flare gun, his grandfather's voice echoed across 2 decades of silence. A true hunter thinks before he strikes, grandson. The prey that escapes teaches the predator that follows. The wisdom cut through his rage like cold water. This boat was more than an object of anger. It was a tool, a possibility he had never dared imagine. Its motor was damaged but not destroyed. Its hull, though scarred, held no fatal breaches. In its storage compartments lay fuel, supplies, and something more precious than all the rest, charts that showed the shipping lanes, the paths that could carry him home. 20 years of accumulated skills suddenly aligned in his mind like stars forming a constellation. The metalworking he had taught himself from salvaged debris, the understanding of currents and weather patterns earned through countless fishing expeditions, the engineering insights gained from decades of problem-solving with nothing but ingenuity and determination. All of it had been preparation for this moment, this choice. But returning meant carrying the very contamination his people feared. His body had adapted to foreign diseases through exposure to debris and wreckage, making him potentially more dangerous than any tourist. He could survive the journey home only to become the instrument of his people's destruction, a ghost returning to kill the living. The irony was perfect and cruel. After 20 years of dreaming of home, he had finally found the means to return, only to discover that his return might complete the very tragedy that had begun with his exile. The photographs scattered at his feet seemed to mock his dilemma, evidence of his people's continued vigilance and the deadly cost of any breach in their isolation. Kyle set down the flare gun and walked to the water's edge, where waves lapped gently at the sand. The tide was turning, as it had twice daily for 20 years, as it would long after his bones had returned to the earth. In that rhythm lay a truth he had always known, but never fully accepted. Some journeys could only be completed alone. The boat rocked gently in the shallows behind him, patient as death, waiting for his decision. Home called to him across the waves, but so did duty and the hardest wisdom of all, knowing that love sometimes demanded the ultimate sacrifice of presence itself. The morning sun climbed higher, and still Kyle stood at the water's edge, balanced between 2 impossible choices, while the tide turned beneath his feet. The morning sun cast long shadows across the beach as Kyle worked methodically on his final creation. His weathered hands, scarred by 2 decades of survival, shaped the bamboo with the precision of a master craftsman. Each piece of his raft had been carefully selected, tested, and bound with vines whose strength he had learned to trust with his life. The vessel before him was unlike anything he had built during his years of exile. Where his shelter had been functional and his tools practical, this raft carried the weight of ceremony. Every joint was wrapped with patterns that echoed the sacred designs of his people. Every support beam was positioned according to the ancient principles his grandfather had taught him as a boy, when the world still made sense and his place in it was certain. 3 months had passed since the voice in the wind had spoken his mother's words, and in that time, Kyle had felt something shifting within himself. The anger that had sustained him through the darkest years was transforming into something else, not acceptance exactly, but a kind of readiness. He was no longer the young hunter who had been cast out in shame and fury. The island had carved away everything unnecessary, leaving behind something harder and more essential. His reflection in the tide pools showed a man his own people might not recognize. His hair, once kept short in the warrior's style, now fell past his shoulders in dark waves streaked with premature grey. His body bore the map of his exile, the raised scar across his ribs from his encounter with the wild boar, the permanent staining on his hands from years of handling certain plants, the subtle changes in posture that came from a lifetime spent reading the forest's moods. But his eyes, those were what had changed most. Where once they had burned with the certainty of youth, they now held depths that spoke of hard-won wisdom and a kind of peace that could only come from facing the worst of oneself and surviving. As he secured the last of the water containers to the raft's frame, Kyle found himself thinking of Tano. His childhood friend would be a father now, possibly even a chief. The boys they had once been seemed like characters from a story told around someone else's fire. He wondered if Tano ever thought of him, if his name was still forbidden to speak, or if time had simply erased him from the tribe's memory, as completely as the tide erased footprints from the sand. The supplies arranged across the raft represented everything he had learned about survival, distilled into its most portable form. Dried fish and fruits that would last weeks, fresh water in bamboo containers sealed with tree sap, fire-making materials wrapped in waterproof leaves, a selection of tools and weapons that had proven themselves in countless situations. But more important than any physical supplies was the knowledge he carried, not just the hunting and gathering skills of his people, but the deeper understanding he had gained through solitude. He had learned to read weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, to sense the subtle changes in animal behavior that preceded danger, to find sustenance and shelter in environments that would kill most men within days. The afternoon brought an unusual stillness to the air, as if the island itself was holding its breath. Keel had planned to launch at dawn the following day, timing his departure with the tides and weather patterns he had been studying for months. But something in the quality of the light, the behavior of the birds, the very feel of the wind on his skin, told him that conditions might not remain favorable much longer. He walked the perimeter of his camp one final time, visiting each location that had become significant during his exile. The grove where he had weathered his first monsoon, the freshwater spring that had saved his life during the great drought of his 7th year, the rocky outcropping where he had faced down the leopard that had stalked him for weeks, proving to himself that he was predator, not prey. At each place, he spoke a few words in the old language, not quite prayers but acknowledgments, of what he had learned, what he had lost, what he was leaving behind. The island had been harsh teacher and reluctant mother, enemy and sanctuary. It had stripped away everything he thought he knew about himself and forced him to discover what remained when all illusions were burned away. As evening approached, Kyle made his decision. The weather signs were growing more pronounced, and every instinct honed by years of survival told him that tomorrow might be too late. He would launch with the night tide, using the darkness to slip away from the island as quietly as he had lived upon it. He spent his final hours completing the rituals of departure his people performed before any significant journey. Body paint created from island clays marked his skin with protective symbols. His weapons received final blessings. The raft itself was consecrated with offerings to the spirits of sea and wind. The moon rose full and bright, illuminating a path across the dark waters that stretched toward home. The canoe sliced through familiar waters as Kyle's weathered hands gripped the paddle with trembling certainty. 20 years had passed since he'd seen these particular currents, felt the specific rhythm of waves against this stretch of coral reef. The island grew larger with each stroke, its dense canopy unchanged, eternal, his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Smoke rose from cooking fires. The scent of roasted fish and wild honey drifted across the water, triggering memories so vivid they made his chest ache. Children's laughter echoed from the beach where he'd once played, where he'd learned to hunt, where he'd made the choice that severed him from everything he knew. Kyle beached his canoe beside others he didn't recognize, their construction subtly different from what he remembered. 2 decades was a lifetime. New hands had shaped these vessels, new minds had adapted old techniques. He wondered how many of his childhood friends still lived, how many had taken wives, raised children, grown old. 3 young hunters emerged from the tree line, their faces painted for ceremony, bows already drawn. They moved with the fluid grace he remembered, but their eyes held no recognition. To them, he was a stranger approaching sacred ground. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had broken the ultimate taboo by engaging with outsiders was now the outsider himself. "Peace," he called in the old language, his voice cracked from disuse. The words felt strange on his tongue after years of silence. "I am Kael, son of Manu, grandson of Tekka the far-seer." The youngest hunter's bow wavered slightly. Perhaps he'd heard the old stories. Perhaps the name meant something still. But the others held firm, arrows nocked and ready. Protocol demanded they defend the shore against any intrusion. "Kael died 20 years ago," the eldest called back, his voice steady but curious. "He broke the sacred law and was cast into the sea." "I did not die," Kael replied, stepping slowly from his canoe, hands visible and empty, "though perhaps I should have." Movement in the tree line caught his attention. More figures appeared, not hunters this time, but elders. His pulse quickened as he recognized the familiar shuffle of old Nuru, now ancient beyond measure but still alive. Still the keeper of laws and traditions, the man who had pronounced his exile. And there, emerging last from the shadows like a ghost from his deepest memories, was his brother Tanu. The years had carved lines into Tanu's face, silvered his hair, broadened his shoulders with the weight of responsibility. He wore the bone ornaments of a chief, the sacred shells that marked him as a decision-maker. Kael's exile had elevated him, as such things often did. "Brother," Tanu said simply, his voice carrying across the sand like a physical force. "Brother," Kael replied, and 20 years of isolation crystallized into that single moment of recognition. The hunters lowered their bows at Tanu's gesture, but tension still crackled in the air. Sacred laws weren't easily set aside, even for blood, especially for blood. "Why have you returned?" Old Nuru wheezed, stepping forward with the aid of a carved staff. His clouded eyes seemed to look through Kael rather than at him. "The waters claimed you. The ancestors received your spirit. What walks among us now?" Kael reached into his canoe and withdrew the bundle he'd carried for so long. The fragments of the outsider's strange materials, the metal tools he'd salvaged, the knowledge he'd gained from his forbidden encounter. But also something else, carved pieces of whalebone, etched with symbols of his own devising. A record of his survival, his story. "I return to offer what I have learned," he said carefully. 20 years alone taught me things that might serve the people, about the changing world, about what approaches from beyond our waters. It was true, though not the whole truth. In his isolation, he'd seen signs, distant ships growing more frequent, aircraft passing overhead, the subtle changes in weather patterns that spoke of a world in flux. His people's isolation was becoming harder to maintain. The knowledge he'd gained, the price he'd paid for it, might matter more than anyone realized. Tanu studied him with eyes that held both love and wariness. The law was clear. Death or exile, there is no provision for return. "Laws serve the people," Kael said, meeting his brother's gaze. "Not the reverse." Nuru's laugh was like dry leaves rustling, still the questioner, still the one who pushes boundaries. He tilted his head, listening to something only he could hear. The ancestors whisper, "They are divided." The old shaman's words hung in the salt air like a challenge. Kael had survived the impossible, learned the forbidden, and returned to face judgment once more. But this time, the stakes were higher than his own life. This time, the future of his people hung in the balance.